Welcome to Human Risk, a podcast dedicated to the understanding of human behaviour as a risk. Here's your host, Christian Hunt.
Hello and welcome back to the Human Risk podcast. On this episode, I'm taking a break from coronavirus-led topics to speak to Steve Martin and Joe Marks, the authors of a recently published book. The book is called Messengers and looks at who we listen to, who we don't, and why. Although we recorded this before the majority of us went into lockdown, and therefore the virus wasn't really a topic of conversation, there are things that are highly relevant to the current situation. In a period of uncertainty, we're all looking to make sense of a complex world, and so are in receipt of lots of messages from different sources. Understanding who we are drawn towards listening to, and who we might naturally not listen to, is incredibly useful in the current environment. And of course, we're being bombarded with instructions, opinions, and facts. What you'll find out from the podcast and the book is that often the messenger is more important than the message itself. Steve is an experienced behavioural scientist, having worked with Robert Cialdini, one of the great original thinkers in this space, a topic I pick up in our discussion. Joe is a doctoral researcher who specialises in looking at people's perceptions of themselves and how their environment influences their cognition and decisions. I've previously recommended messengers in my newsletter, and you can work out that I wouldn't have invited them onto the podcast if I didn't think the book and their insights were worth sharing. As ever, I hope you learn something both about other people's messages to you and how you are as a messenger yourself, and are inspired by my conversation with Steve Martin and Joe Marks. Steve and Joe, welcome to the Human Risk podcast. It's an absolute pleasure to have you.
Hey Christian, good to be here.
Yeah, thank you for having us.
So one of the things I always like to ask people who are working in the field of behavioural science is, how did you get into that? What was it that stimulated your interest in the field of human decision making? Maybe Steve, if we can start with you.
Yeah, well, I'll tell you one thing it wasn't. I didn't go to my careers master at school and say I want to become a behavioural scientist. I think I probably wanted to be a train driver or a doctor or something along those lines. So I'm largely here by, I think, a combination of good fortune and being in the right place at the right time, and you know, having been lucky enough to be introduced to, you know, one of the founding fathers of our science, Robert Cialdini, 20 odd years ago now. So I started out in the big corporate world. Initially, we were interested in working with Cialdini on a particular project that I was involved in this large company that I actually worked with, and then the company I was working with subsequently got taken over by an even bigger company, and so that led to a path to Bob Cialdini and I working together. That was 20 years ago, and haven't looked back since. So an awful lot of good fortune, I think, Christian, is the reason why I'm doing what I'm doing now.
I love hearing those stories about how people got into it because, as you say, there wasn't a standard career path that was available until very recently. And Joe, what was it that got you into the field of behavioural science?
Yeah, no, I think I was very interested in human behaviour and human thinking as a teenager, and sort of found psychology, popular science books that I just thought were absolutely fascinating, and something that I wanted to kind of study at higher education level. And, during my degree, then I kind of stumbled upon Cialdini's book as well, actually, and thought it was, so fascinating, so applied, so useful in terms of achieving a number of goals that you might want in your personal life or in kind of business life. And then it was just by good fortune that I saw Cialdini and Steve were actually giving a talk at the LSE when I started my master's for their new book, The Small Big, at the time. And I went along with some friends, saw them speak, and then had the good fortune then of meeting Steve not long afterwards and working with him for a few years on various kind of projects, looking at, for example, how to reduce fare evasion behaviors on a big public transport system, as well as many others, and eventually came back to UCL to do my PhD, which is kind of where I am now.
You both reference Robert Cialdini, and I will come back and ask about the messenger effect he's had on both of you, because he's clearly been a big influence. But Looking firstly at the book, when I read it, and it is a cracking read, it seemed to me that it was very, very timely, very, very interesting. But it seemed to me it was fascinating that no one else had covered this topic before. And I sort of looked around to see if anybody else had, and I couldn't really see anything. So what was it that inspired you to look at a topic that is incredibly relevant, but not something anyone else seems to have looked at?
Well, I think there's a few things, Christian, that happened. So one is, and as Joe rightly said, we're both intimately connected with Cialdini's work. And, Bob and his research is genius. What he's done these last 35, 40 years is essentially write, the playbook, the DNA, if you want, of what you should put into a message that increases the likelihood that people will be persuaded by it, will want to engage in it. But one of the things that we would often do when we were talking about these things, we've got a little office meeting room at the back of our office up here, and we often sit around at lunchtimes, 6 or 7 of us, and just chat about stuff. And a commonly recurring subject was this idea of, how is it that there's all these people in society that can say these things that are clearly not true, or that are mistaken, or just, fanciful, and there are people out there that believe them? It can't just be the message that they're giving. There must be something about them as the messenger, as the communicator, as the source of the information that is also having a significant influence. And, when you start those conversations, invariably they lead to that common scenario that we all have experienced. When you go into the office one day with an idea and you tell your colleagues about it, and they all look at you in that strange way and go, well, no, that's not a good idea at all. And yet a couple of days later, someone else comes along with the exact same idea, and all of a sudden everybody thinks it's the best idea since sliced bread. And we've all experienced that. It's frustrating. It's annoying that, we say something and no one listens to us, but someone else can say the exact same thing and it's enthusiastically embraced. And that's when Joe and I kind of started to get really intrigued by it and say, well, what are the mechanisms that are going on here? That, there must be research that's done to understand these phenomena. And it turns out there's loads of research that's actually been done, but no researchers have really, well, at least not for 40 years or so, actually taken the time to curate all that available research and come up with, a systematic way of understanding how messengers influence behaviors, not just in our communities and in our families, in businesses, but in society more generally. And as you rightly said, it kind of was somewhat timely as well with, some of the stuff that's happening in the US, and then subsequently with Brexit and here in the UK. You've got all these characters that are saying these things that, are often questionable in fact and wisdom, yet people are embracing it. And so, we got lucky with the timing as well. But that's how the book came about. I
love that bit about other people coming in with the same idea that we've had, and sort of it feels like they've stolen your idea. I think we all recognise that. I'm struck as I look at the sort of people in the public eye, and I'm thinking particularly of politicians here, that it does feel like we're being lied to more often. And I wonder whether, is it that we're experiencing something new at the present time, or is it just we are more aware of the fact that we're being misled because there's greater transparency around what's going on? Have you got any thoughts around that dynamic?
Yeah, I think that, there's probably a mixture of both. I think that there's always been, lies in current affairs and politics. It has a kind of troubled relationship with the truth. Going back, funnily enough, I've been reading a book from, I think, about 2005 by Peter Oborn called Lies in Politics. I thought it's a nice, it's almost this pre-post-truth era. So I thought it was interesting that he was writing about that already, and he was actually talking about the Blair years and saying the exact same things that are being said now, but about Tony Blair and Alistair Campbell and that government. So I do think that it's been there for a long time, but the difference now is, I think the huge amount of exposure that we have through social media in particular, but also, generally the internet, being able to look up whatever information you like, and a lot of fake information being posted in many ways, I do think contributes to that rise. in not only misinformation and disinformation, but also people almost living in separate realities when it comes to their consumption of information and then subsequently their beliefs.
Does that make us more vulnerable to messengers if we're in the echo chamber, for want of a better phrase?
Yeah. I mean, I think it absolutely does, because the primary reason that messenger effects have a strong hold on us is that we are taking a decision shortcut. It's a rule of thumb that we rely on when either we want to, because there's a kind of desirability element there, or because information is too abundant and, we just need some easy way to make a decision. We kind of have this limited cognitive capacity. So to make do, then we rely on rules of thumb like a messenger who's delivering the information. It's sort of an easier way to decide who to listen to than to actually comprehensively go through what everybody's saying, weigh up all the points of facts and arguments, and then come to a kind of conclusion through evidence like that.
The really interesting thing, though, here, Christian, is that their influence in that moment isn't ring-fenced. And so what we mean by that is, once we have decided that someone is worth listening to, they have a particular trait that we see, we've decided that they're expert, or we decided that they have some sort of societal position, so that makes them worth listening to. We very rapidly and easily then start to assume all sorts of other potentially positive characteristics about them that have no basis in truth at all. Well, if they're, rich and famous, they must know a lot about X, or, if they're attractive, they must be also good at these things. So these halo effects start to kick in, and that's what kind of amplifies the issue. We may legitimately be following, one of these heuristics for good reason, but that doesn't necessarily mean that it stops there. We subsequently make all sorts of inferences about other things, about that same messenger, that can often lead us in a perhaps not the right direction.
In a way, that's quite worrying, really, isn't it? Because as I think about celebrities who sort of stretch their brand, so maybe musicians go into headphones and then maybe into perfume and into a range of other activities, and you can see many of them straying into politics and other campaigns. And, what you're basically saying is that we will take the credibility they have in one field and apply it to another. That's really quite worrying, isn't it? If we have, say, a musician that is politically engaged on a topic, possibly that they're not an expert in or don't really understand.
Indeed. Your podcast, talks about this. It's called Human Risk. And, one of the examples that we actually quite like that illustrates that perfectly was a few years ago when, a Cantonese pop star, pretty well known, good music, lots of fans, clearly a good and talented musician, started to post on, social media claims about the flu vaccine and the fact that those people that received the flu vaccine were at a 90% likelihood of catching the virus. I mean, that's clearly not true. It's kind of... goes against all, the good published evidence. And therein lies the risk. Therein lies the human risk that, if we're using, a single judgment, they're rich, they're famous, they have notoriety, they're good at this. There are going to be subsets of the population that are subsequently potentially be influenced by their messages in other domains that have absolutely nothing to do with why they're seen as a credible messenger in the first instance. So, there's a lot of risk associated with this.
What is it that we can do to inoculate ourselves from this problem? I mean, you've said that we're all susceptible to it. Clearly, the first answer is buy the book and read it. But if this is something that impacts all of us, it's not just sort of gullible people or idiots that are taken in, we're all influenced in this way. Are there things that we can do to kind of protect ourselves from this potentially nefarious influence over us?
Yeah, and I think, even we will fall for it, of course. Even as the authors of the book, we're all human. And this is a very human trait to kind of, look at people or know people and form an impression of them and rely on that impression is something that humans have evolved to do. Often it leads us in the right direction, but as Steve said, sometimes it leads us in the wrong direction. And, having an awareness of these message traits will surely help, because I think, being knowledgeable and understanding how they impact us and what to look for when we're deciding whether a messenger is affecting us, not because of what they're saying, but because of who they are. I mean, that can only help us to stop, but to stop listening to the wrong messengers. But, I do think at the same time that we are going to fall into this trap over and over again. And actually, it takes a lot of cognitive effort and, kind of deliberation in order to really take a step, stop, think about what we're doing. And that's often not how we behave. We kind of make decisions in the moment. I think that hopefully what we might be able to do is introduce some healthy skepticism, and also bring up kind of, interesting and other ways of thinking about certain things, specifically kind of attractiveness bias, which, isn't often talked about in, when we talk about bias, we often think of recruitment bias, we think of gender, race, but we don't think about attractiveness. And attractiveness actually has a similar impact, for example, on people's earnings over a lifetime as race and gender do. So in the US, at least, it has about a 10 to 15% impact on somebody's likely life earnings. And that's huge. And it's something that we need to be considering and talking about and aware of in the same way that we are these other more concrete effects, I think. Because, the idea that somebody who's just born very good looking would be benefited all through their life, and including in hiring and the labor market, relative to somebody who's just unfortunately not born as good looking, seems incredibly unfair. And something that we should be kind of striving to change and work towards changing, yeah.
It's fascinating when you talk about the sort of natural talent that people have for this. And clearly, we're all born with advantages and disadvantages on a relative basis. But is the sort of the messenger talent, if you like, is that something that we can teach ourselves and something we can learn, or are we born with it? I guess I'm asking a sort of nature versus nurture question.
Well, I think there are some things that are naturally gifted to us, attractiveness being one. In fact, actually, it just might be helpful to talk about these specific messenger traits, because the research finds that there are 8 in total, and 4 we categorize as hard messenger effects. These are the kind of traits that communicate that a messenger has some sort of status over their audience. So their socioeconomic position, whether they have competence and expertise, whether they're dispositionally dominant is another one, and then attractiveness being the 4th. Whereas in contrast, the 4 softer effects, these are essentially the traits that communicate that a messenger has connectedness with their audience. They're not seeking to get ahead of their audience, they're seeking to get along with their audience. And they do that through their warmth, sometimes through expressing vulnerabilities, by signaling their trustworthiness, and finally, essentially being able to demonstrate their charismatic nature. So they're charismatic communicators. So you have these 4 hard and these 4 soft traits. And there are some that clearly are, gifted to one through that evolutionary process. I think, you do happen to be attractive. There's evidence to suggest that some people, just from a personality perspective, are dispositionally dominant. But all of us, I think, can learn to be a little bit warmer. All of us can learn, some of the aspects that increase trustworthiness with an audience. And even though until recently, the scientific community is actually being not really clear about how it defines charisma. We now have a pretty good definition of charisma, and the evidence suggests, Christian, that all of us can learn to be a little bit more charismatic. So the book isn't actually saying, get better at all these 8 traits and you will be heard more. we're not quite going that far, but we would say be aware of these traits, and there are certain traits that you can improve your skill upon. You know, you can even take a test actually and determine where your strengths and weaknesses lie across this spectrum of messenger traits.
Yeah, that comes highly recommended. I've done that, and it was really informative. Not going to reveal what it said about me, but you can find that on the Messengers website. Can you remind us of what the URL for that is?
Yeah, messengersthebook.com, and surely you came across as attractive and charismatic, Christian, right?
I did it a few times, actually, to make sure that I got the answer that I wanted.
We all do that.
You talked before about Bob Cialdini and the influence he's had on both of you, and I'm intrigued what it was about him as a messenger that has had this profound impact on both of you.
Well, there were two things from my perspective about Bob, and Joe knows Bob as well, so maybe Joe's point of view is somewhat different, but Bob really came into this field at the very onset of where we were starting to look to evidence to help us understand human decision making. That book, the original Influence book, I think a lot of people are surprised when they learn how old it actually is. That book was originally published in the mid-1980s as a consumer defense book. And it really was the first book of its kind that took an evidence-based approach to understanding how people are influenced. And largely it was done as a kind of a defense book. The thinking was that if, citizens learned about these principles of how they were being manipulated and influenced, they could defend themselves. Of course, the reality was somewhat different insofar as the only people that really read the book were the people that were interested in influencing and manipulating. So, but what attracted me to that was the fact that, it really was the first book of its kind that was steeped in evidence and credibility. So in terms of these messenger traits, Bob is an incredibly competent expert in this field, the world's leading, I think, it's not just me saying this. I think it's largely the case that he is regarded as the most cited living expert in this field. But it kind of helps that he's also just an incredibly lovely guy as well. He's incredibly warm. He's very welcoming, and so that helps as well. So that's my experience of Bob and my introduction. I found him both incredibly competent and expert, but also a very warm human being as well. I guess Joe knows him as well, so maybe Joe.
Yeah, no, I'd absolutely agree. I mean, he's clearly one of the world's kind of brightest minds, and luckily turned his hand to social psychology. So we were. He's given so much to the field, and all these kind of interesting effects that people, often don't associate with Bob Cialdini. I think he's most commonly known for kind of social proof. But if I'm always stumbling across papers of his from the kind of 70s and 80s that, it's just amazing to see how much research he did, and in so many topics, including kind of empathy and pro-social behavior, as well as kind of more kind of self-presentation effects. It's really remarkable just how much work he has got his name on. So he's clearly got the expertise there, and thanks to his book selling many millions of copies, that there's, I wouldn't say he's a celebrity in the world. He doesn't go out and have paparazzi, but I mean, he is well known. He has celebrities. He told us a story last time we saw him, actually, about a celebrity who came up to him and said, "Hey, Dr. Z, loved your book." And this guy did have paparazzi following him around. And, so he's well up there, and is known by kind of various governments and administrations who are interested in his work. So that name recognition and status goes along with his expertise, as well as his wonderfully warm, personable nature as well, that make him a very effective messenger.
Yeah, I completely agree with you. I think those books that he's written are still incredibly fresh nowadays, a bit like a fine wine. They've aged really well. And there's lots of books that you can read on behavioural science that sort of feel of a certain age. His seem to have a kind of timeless quality. And so if any readers haven't read any of his stuff, highly recommended. I'll put some notes in the show notes that you can see those. But completely agree with you there.
I think you're absolutely right about that. And, the fact is, I spoke to him a couple of days ago, and he's still going to his office every morning at ASU, despite the fact he's now retired, and is currently updating the 7th edition of Influence to include now, all these latest studies of how these principles play out in online and social media scenarios, which clearly weren't available, in the 80s, the 90s, and the early 2000s when previous editions had been written. So I think you're absolutely right, Christian. The fact that, he's, close to, 35, 36 years after the first edition was published, he's still in his office every morning writing the latest edition. That's how timely this work is, I think.
And that brings us quite nicely to a subject that really interests me, which is online gives us a whole host of new communications methods. So we've got IM, we've got video online, we've got email. And I'm intrigued to know what impact that has on messaging as a whole. I mean, is the medium having an impact on people? Are there some people that are more effective through different media, or does it dumb certain types of messenger down? Is there any sort of discernible trend here?
Yeah, no, I think in general, the more kind of humanizing a channel is, the greater effect a messenger can have, because we're able to get a lot more information from a face-to-face interaction. We have a lot more kind of social feeling going on in that situation than if it's more removed. So there's been studies comparing, for example, asking a request over email versus asking face-to-face, and they find that it's about 3 times more likely to be accepted if it's face-to-face than via email. And, there's a host of reasons for that. So I do think that the social obligation to say yes becomes much greater when, you're faced with a person, they are asking you on the spot and waiting for your answer. But also because, they are more humanized. They are a real human being that you can see, and you can, understand their emotions and relate to them in a way that you can't just through some abstract text. So I think, there's a few stages in between these two extremes. You have kind of phone, which, gives you voice information. So you might have, for example, no effect of attractiveness over the phone, but you might have an effect of the kind of tone of your voice, or even the kind of class of your voice has also been shown to have an effect on how receptive people are to each other's messages. And then, the kind of world of Skype and video calling, you have that step too, but I think it's not quite as personal as, of course, a face-to-face meeting, although you then do have the visual effects that might come with a messenger. So, what they're wearing, where they are, what they look like, how they say things, the expression on their face, their kind of non-verbal behaviors will then reach through. Strikes me, Christian, that there's something interesting that's related to, the human risk element here as well, is that, if you're a large organization and you have, a message that you want to deliver, regarding risk, compliance, reducing questionably ethical behavior in an organization, the attractive and quick thing to do, I guess, is to kind of fire off an email or, write some sort of edict and attach it to a message on a board and then send it out. But, as Joe is exactly right, if the kind of features of the messenger result in up to 3 times as much, engagement and likely compliance with those messages, maybe the message here is that email isn't perhaps the right channel, and that we need to be, selecting the right messenger and ensuring that messenger is delivering these messages face to face, or at least we can look at them or see them. It'd be a really interesting study to see whether in those kind of risk and compliance scenarios, whether the visibility of the messenger rather than the kind of electronic message that's typically sent out has some sort of down the line effect in terms of the responsible and ethical behaviors that then, get engendered in an organization.
And I think that's a very interesting point, because one of the reasons this topic fascinates me from a human risk perspective is that obviously one of the ways that you get people within an organization to do what you want is you communicate to them. And so a lot of thought is given by organizations to who is going to communicate. So they think about, for example, the CEO sends certain messages. Maybe if it's something dull and technical, you get your general counsel or your head of compliance to send it. But the thought process seems to sort of stop there, and it's they just look at the fact that we'll have a senior person sending the stuff senior people ought to send, and they don't think much about the different forms of messenger that could be used. And I think that's a massive missed opportunity. But it also means that many corporate communications misfire because they haven't necessarily selected the optimal messenger.
Well, actually, I'm not entirely sure if a lot of thought is given to who the messenger is. Because it strikes me that, to say this is a really, really important message, so therefore the CEO should deliver it, or this is a message about IT, so it comes from the head of IT, or this is a message about compliance, so it comes from the head of compliance. That doesn't seem to me to be particularly well thought through at all. I guess probably an everyday example that most people can kind of connect with is savvy parents, for example, know that if they want to deliver a message to their 15-year-old son about the importance of doing their homework, they're the worst messenger to be delivering that message. Much better to get the cute 15-year-old girl from next door to deliver that message. Much more connected. That kid is much, much more likely to listen to the exact same message when it comes through from a different messenger. So, actually, Christian, I'm not entirely convinced that when organizations think about delivering these messages, that they do think that deeply about who the right messenger is. I think they think deeply about who the obvious messenger is. That doesn't necessarily mean this is the most effective messenger.
Yeah, that's a very good point, a really important distinction. I think typically what happens is that they look at the subject matter and then say, who is the most appropriate person to send this out? So if the subject relates to something in your job title, you are automatically deemed to be the most appropriate person to send the message.
Indeed. I think the other thing that kind of plays into this that also kind of complicates things somewhat is if you are the generator or the creator of this message, if it's your idea or if it's your proposal or if it's your policy or strategy, you kind of convince yourself that you are the right messenger to deliver it. Because after all, who could do it better than you? Because it came from you. And this is one of these situations where the ability to take one's ego out of the situation and recognize, okay, from a competence and a skill and experience perspective, you might be the person that curates the message. Clearly, you have the skills and the expertise to do that, but that doesn't necessarily mean that you're going to be listened to. So sometimes it is the case that separating out the message and the messenger and recognizing that those two components don't necessarily have to originate from the same source is also important.
Yeah, I think there's an interesting parallel here with things like Uber, where you've got startups that have very aggressive CEOs that build the business up and kind of grow it, and then they don't want to let go. And there's a reluctance to get rid of them because they're the people that are taking that. Even if they're not the right people to be taking the business forward, they sort of seem to want to cling on. Everybody wants them to cling on beyond when they're useful. And you could see the same sort of thing with messages, where it might make sense to hand the message transmittal over to someone else, but I'm guessing that if you have been responsible and had control of it, to suddenly lose that control could feel a little bit similarly. There's a detriment to losing control of the message.
Indeed, it diminishes my status. Perhaps people think differently of me, and that dents my ego, and those are kind of completely understandable psychological effects. But they might also diminish the impact of the message, indeed.
And one of the other things I do want to draw the listeners' attention to, Steve, is that you write a column for the British Airways in-flight business magazine. And I firstly want to thank you because actually it's been incredibly powerful for me as a piece of social proof. My dad was flying with British Airways and he spotted this piece that you'd written in the magazine and sent it to me and said that I really should get in touch with this guy because he seemed to be doing something similar to me. And he got very excited about it, and it served a really useful piece of social proof for me that doing something in behavioural science isn't a complete waste of time. So thank you for that. But I'm also fascinated by the column and the idea around the environment in which you receive it. And so I wondered whether there's any insights you have based around your work you've been doing for them there, as to how that message is received. Does the environment change things? You're sat obviously in a confined space, and so I'm just really intrigued as to how media in general impacts the idea of messengers and their effectiveness.
I think it does. So yeah, I mean the column for British Airways, it's been 11 years now. I can't believe how long. Every month they ask me to write another one, and they haven't stopped writing. They haven't stopped asking me to do that yet. So it's a nice little place because, as you rightly say, there's a captive audience of however many, a couple of million people that and you've got to. It's a nice discipline as well because I only have 500 words, so that sounds like an awful lot of words. It really is not to get something usable and generally applicable to the wide variety of people that fly on British Airways. So, but yeah, I know. I'm glad. I know that you knew about this a long time before your dad saw it recently. So that's good. But I mean, probably Joe is a good person to talk more broadly here about the impact of different newspaper brands or how those kind of publications are seen as messenger effects in their own right as well.
Absolutely. There's, a lot of research now showing that brands are actually seen in the exact same way that we view humans. So we have evolved these kind of person perception mechanisms to decide kind of who is warm, who's competent, who's trustworthy, who's dominant. And we just use those. We are kind of, when relating with companies, our kind of go-to is to go to these natural, intuitive, automatic systems. And that, makes sense. There are actually people behind the brands making the decisions. So, even logically, I think that's kind of a sensible thing to do. But it does mean that, certain brands, for example, will be seen as warm and fuzzy, while others are kind of cold and competent. And I think, you could think about kind of distinctions between Amazon and Google probably is quite a good one, or even Facebook and Google.
Your phone needs to be unlocked for that.
I've said Google, my phone started responding.
That's somewhat scary, isn't it?
Yeah. It's got a mind of its own sometimes, but hopefully it's not listening to our every word. But because then it'll send bad messages back to Google that I'm ripping on their brand. Although actually I was going to say the exact opposite, which is that, I think with Amazon and especially Facebook, you have this kind of malign sort of undercurrent. People view them with skepticism, that they're seen as very competent at what they do. They're huge organizations that lots of people buy into. They have a lot of resources and status. But we don't think they have our best intentions at heart. They think that they are trying to make profit. And especially in the case of Facebook, due to the data scandals, I think Amazon have the problem, because of kind of worker conditions, and they are always, have the spotlight on them for not paying taxes. What's interesting is that Google are very much in the same situation as Amazon. Maybe not in terms of the workers, but in terms of the tax, certainly, I think they play by the same rule book. And yet Google have this kind of warm, fuzzy feel to them. People don't mind giving their data to Google, but they do mind giving their data to Facebook. Even though they're both kind of huge tech giants, probably operating from very similar rule playbooks a lot of the time. And it just shows that how these messenger traits apply to the kind of people behind a brand or to the brand itself. And that does really influence people's behaviors. And it could be their kind of the products they buy, the websites they use, in this case, kind of whose data they're going to give their data up to.
And I find that really interesting because when I was working in the banking sector, in the sort of traditional banks, it was obvious that the firm was sitting on a whole load of data about their clients that could be extremely useful. So the bank will know when people are having an affair. They will know when they're likely to want to change a vehicle. They know when they're likely to want to engage in certain types of expenditure, because they're sitting on this pile of data. And yet they're not really allowed to do anything, both for legal reasons, because the contract doesn't permit them to do it. But secondly, there's a social piece here. And there's an example I know of where one bank tried to engage with its customers, and they got together with a high-end automotive firm. And basically, when people logged onto their online banking, anyone who was sort of in the frame for buying a new car, whose pattern suggested they were about to buy a new car, maybe their lease was running out, had a promotion pushed at them that just sort of said, hey, are you thinking about buying a new car? And the customers went absolutely ballistic because that wasn't how they saw their relationship with their bank. And so there's this real challenge for those institutions who are sitting on this really valuable data because they can't do the kinds of things that Facebook and Google and other tech companies can do, or indeed startup challenger banks can do, because that's just not how they are perceived by the customers. So there's a very different basis on which that information is held.
Yes, exactly right. The playing fields are anything but level.
And to close us out of this fascinating discussion, I wanted to just ask both of you what your top tips are for the listeners if they want to become better messengers themselves.
Okay, let's answer that in two ways. So the first is to say, well, that there are 8 messenger traits, 4 hard that are status-driven, 4 soft that are connectedness-driven. Are there, of these 8 traits, any specific standout traits that it would be especially a good idea to kind of have in your messenger armory? And we certainly see that trustworthiness is one of those. And, to be careful to not confuse truth and trust. They're not the same thing. Perhaps that's a conversation for another day, Christian. So anything that one can do to build one trust. And then competence is another interesting one. And I think, here there is an immediate opportunity to build your perceived competence and expertise. And that's to ensure that, you are properly introduced when you are presenting, when you go to meetings, when you're in that situation around the table in the office where someone invariably says, well, let's go around the room and introduce ourselves, shall we, before we kick off the meeting, which is never a good thing because, people aren't likely to kind of start by, talking about, all the skills and the expertise they have and the reason they're in the room. They're probably most likely to just kind of, give you information that could be reliably found on their business card. Hi, I'm Steve from IT. So there are opportunities for, leaders and managers to properly introduce everyone in the room and say, right, here's why Christian is in the room because of his expertise in risk and his incredible knowledge of human behavior. Here's the reason why Joe is in the room, et cetera, et cetera. You build that platform of credibility and competence. So anything you can do to get those kind of things going seem to be, I think, pretty quick, importantly costless and honest things that one can do to improve one's competence. So those are the first couple of ideas that come to mind. Joe, I don't know what else you might have too.
As a kind of individual messenger, I think simply expressing positivity is so important. Even at very first impressions, we look at people's kind of facial expression, and if they seem more kind of angry, a look on their face, then they're automatically judged as less trustworthy. Those people lucky enough to kind of have the resemblance of a positive, happy expression on their face are seen as more trustworthy. They are more likely to kind of receive, a kind of investment from somebody in experimental research, hoping that the money will then be given back to them. This is just from a picture of a face. I think in reality, those people who go around, with a kind of positive, non-verbal signal that they're sending out to others saying, I'm a cooperative kind of person who likes to get along with people as opposed to try and get ahead of them or, even against them, kind of compete against them. It's going to get you a long way. There's, plenty of research showing that those who smile more come across as warmer in job interviews and more likely to get the job. Across the board, this effect really seems to play out very strongly, and I think is an obvious quick win.
And actually, Steve, that reminds me, I read precisely that really helpful tip about meetings in your BA column. And I remember thinking, that's exactly what happens. You go to a meeting. If you are sat there and required to introduce yourself, then you spend your whole time worrying about what you're going to say until the point at which you have to say it. And then you're relieved that you've said it and you're paying zero attention whatsoever to the other introductions that are going on. So really powerful, simple example, I think, that illustrates the strength of behavioural science interventions of this kind. And Joe, I absolutely love the fact that you finished us off on such a positive note. In a world where there's lots of negativity, it's great to have that particular thing, and behavioural science fans will be well aware of the peak end rule. So thank you for helping us respect that. Thanks to both of you for sparing the time to come on the podcast. Hugely appreciated. I will put links to the book, your website, and other useful resources in the show notes. But for now, thank you so much, firstly, for writing the book, and secondly, for joining us on the Human Risk podcast. It's been a real pleasure.
Good to speak to you.
Much, Christian.
So that's it for another episode of the Human Risk podcast. My thanks to Steve and Joe for joining me, and to you for listening. Messengers, Who We Listen To, Why We Don't, and Why is out now, and is available in ebook and audiobook formats as well. Do check out the book website, messengersthebook.com, where you can start reading the first chapter right away. There's also a test you can take to find out what kind of messenger you are, and some lovely short videos that look at some of the concepts covered in the book. Links to that and other relevant sites are in the show notes. I'll be back very soon with another episode of the Human Risk podcast. If you're not already a subscriber, you'll find it wherever you get your quality audio content. Thanks again for listening, and do stay safe.